Order. Dr. Caroline Johnson to move the motion.
Thank you, Sir Luke. Today I'd like to shed light on an issue which has the potential to have a significant adverse effect on the constituents that I represent in Sleaford and North Hykeham. I am concerned about the industrialisation of our countryside by large-scale solar farms. Solar power does have its merits in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and transitioning to a sustainable future. However, whilst acknowledging the merits of solar farms, it is also essential that I address the concerns that have been raised by my constituents, and quite rightly so. Some of the solar farms proposed in my constituency will dramatically alter the landscape for the worse, shattering the character of what is not only a beautiful countryside, but highly productive arable land. Rural constituencies such as my own have been particularly plagued by applications for large solar farms. As I'm sure is the case with many of my honourable friends' inboxes, they are often filled with passionate pleas from constituents who will have their homes, sometimes their entire villages, surrounded by a sea of solar panels. Not only will the landscapes they love and cherish be destroyed, but it seems that in many cases they lack any effective means to stop such plans. It is a core tenet of our democracy that we listen to the voices of our communities and we address their concerns. Transparency and an inclusive consultation process are key to fostering a sense of ownership and ensuring that those affected are heard and that their concerns are addressed. Sadly, the consultation process for some solar farms has fallen very short of expectations, failing to adequately engage with the affected communities. The government has produced plans to meet net zero and create sustainable and reliable energy production. My honourable friend the Minister yesterday announced plans to expand British Nuclear, for example. It's estimated by the government that we will need to use 0.5% of land to meet solar panel targets, but it is also estimated that there are 600,000 acres of south-facing industrial roof space which is currently unused. I don't believe the government has anticipated or would wish for all of these panels to be in Lincolnshire. There are essentially three ways of gaining permission to build solar panels. The first is through permitted development rights. Planning permission is not usually needed for up to 50 kilowatts on a domestic roof or 1 megawatt on a commercial roof. Between February and April of this year, the government consulted on expanding those permitted development rights for commercial installations, for example on the roofs of a warehouse. The consultation proposed removing the current threshold of 1 megawatt, as well as expanding rights for solar canopies on non-domestic car parks. This would liberate smaller scale developments which don't destroy the character of the countryside. The government has not yet responded to this consultation, but in the document Powering Up Britain it said it would amend the relevant regulations by the end of the year, and I would appreciate an update from the Minister on what he intends to do, when he intends to do so. The second mechanism is for those mid-scale farms that do not have permitted development rights but fall below 50 megawatts. These are applied for using local planning authorities, essentially elected local councils. Planning for guidance for these says that local planning authorities should consider the site, size, colour and design of solar systems, their visual impact, the effects of glint and of glare, the need for renewable energy not automatically overriding environmental protections, and pertinently, the cumulative impact of solar panels on local amenities and landscapes. The final way planning can be attained is... I will give way.
Thank you for giving way. Congratulations on securing this debate today. On the point of local planning authorities having power to look at and consider individual planning applications for solar farms under a certain size, would she agree that there is potentially an effective way forward here, which is for those local authorities to introduce their own planning policy framework for solar farms to allow them to have local discretion to look at certain local circumstances that may exist within that national guidance?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and he is of course right. But as I will come to later, these are where they are produced are being circumnavigated using the NSIP process to avoid local community engagement. So the final way that planning can be attained for large-scale solar farms is by NSIP process. So Part 3 of the Planning Act 2008 states that solar farms with a generating capacity above 50 megawatts are considered NSIPs. These are not decided locally, These are decided by the Secretary of State. And speaking to constituents, I'm also aware that NSIP applications, if successful, can contain an element of compulsory purchase orders. And I'm aware that some landowners feel intimidated by this fact when they're being produced by a whole plethora of people prospecting, asking them to rent their land. They worry if they don't comply, they will lose their land to compulsory purchase orders. And this is, again, something that the government must address. You can come back in.
I think I'm giving way. We've had a major problem in Suffolk with solar farms being brought forward, but very few of them have used that final mechanism that she's outlined, and a lot of them have been at the discretion of the local planning authority, be that in cases that I can think of in my constituency, Mid-Suffolk in particular, to examine on their merits. But the lack of a local framework against which the planning authority judges these applications means that the developer is in fact empowered and local communities disempowered, and unfortunately that's meant that a number of applications have gone through. So again, I just wondered whether she would again agree with me about pushing this issue with the Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, my honourable friend, for his second intervention. He's absolutely right that if these applications are of the size affected by decided by local authorities, then if there's a local plan in place, the local authority is able to make much more local-based decisions on what it wants rather than what it's told to do. So he's absolutely right. A local plan can be very helpful for the smaller application. I was informed yesterday that there are 12 NSIP applications currently in process in Lincolnshire of large solar farms, including Beacon Fen, Springwell, Heckington Fen and Foss Green Energy, which all appear in my constituency. I'm also reliably informed there are further 2 NSIP solar applications in the pipeline for North Kesteven. However, it was notable as of yesterday there was only one small-scale application to our local council, and so the government needs to reflect, in my view, on why it's created a planning system for solar panels that drives applications of the NSIP scale, such that we have so many NSIPs in Lincolnshire and so few small applications comparatively, particularly because, as we've just said, the NSIPs local people have decision-making process taken away from them rather than given to them. The upgrade of substations on the electrical network, such as the one in Navenby, should be a positive enhancement to local infrastructure. But what's happened in practice is it's acted as a magnet for speculators seeking to cash in. Where substations have been upgraded, we get a cluster of large solar farm applications near to them, as it's cheaper for those companies who want to build them. As a result, again, instead of a large number of small, low-impact solar farms, we get a small number of gigantic industrial farms which utterly ruin the landscape, in some cases choking entire villages of potential future expansion and turning what has traditionally been a food-producing haven into a vast, glimmering desert.
On that point,
I will.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, Nicky Wade. Can I congratulate her on securing this important debate? She talks about food-producing land. Our EFRA Select Committee has just been finishing our food security inquiry, and one of the key areas we looked at was land use. And solar, I'm sure, has a big part to play in our energy mix, but we must be careful of the unintended consequences about taking prime food-producing land and the green belt out and replacing it. It's similar to the trees debate. The right trees in the right places, it should be the right solar panels in the right places. Does she agree with me that there are the right places to put them, not least the many roofs across the country, not least on agricultural buildings?
Absolutely not.
I couldn't agree with him more. In fact, in some respects, he has paraphrased my speech into a few sentences very eloquently, so thank you. I'd ask the Minister to ensure that when his government's improving infrastructure, he doesn't destroy the countryside in the process. The scale of these applications are quite difficult to imagine simply from a map. Although notice my honourable friend from Gainsborough has brought a map with him today. But each is around 2,000 or more acres. 2,000 acres is just over 3 square miles, and some of these NSIP applications are larger, in some cases substantially larger than that. We'd also like to raise the threat of glint and glare. So glint and glare is the light reflecting essentially off the solar panels. And in Lincolnshire, this is especially significant due to the presence of the RAF. The red arrows operate from RAF Waddington, which sits on the edge of my constituency. Not only that, but the limestone cliff top means that the Foss Way site that's currently proposed will be an especially visible eyesore from across the constituency. Many of my constituents choose to live in a rural setting because of the superb views, and these solar farms threaten to spoil those entirely. The impact will also extend to house prices, and many of my constituents fear that their house prices with unburdened views would sell for much more, leaving the residents individually out of pocket as well. I'm especially...
We're on a really good way.
I will give way, yes.
I was pausing to move to our next incisive and powerful point. I wondered if you might recognise, given her expertise in this field, rather as my honourable friend said, that arable land available to grow the food we need to be secure is at its lowest level since 1945 and being lost around 100,000 acres a year. We've lost over 750,000 acres in the 10 years to 2019. So you can't have it both ways. You either have food security through the production of domestically produced foodstuffs, or you give up land for solar and onshore wind.
All right, honourable friend, as ever, is right, and as ever has read my mind as I was going to move on to talk about food production, so thank you. I'm particularly concerned about the use of good agricultural land because farming is a cornerstone in my constituency. It doesn't just form the backbone of the economy in my constituency, but it has evolved to underpin the area's very culture. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine have revealed the fragility of the global food market, so it's more important than ever that we make strides towards becoming agriculturally self-sufficient. I'm informed by the Greater Lincolnshire Local Enterprise Partnership that Lincolnshire alone produces 30% of the UK's vegetables, 18% of its poultry, and is responsible for 12% of the country's total food production. This is all from a county covering less than 3% of the UK's land mass. Lincolnshire, without a doubt, has some of the UK's best and most versatile farmland, yet it seems to be particularly targeted by these large solar farms. My honourable friend and member for South Derbyshire is not able to be in the debate today, but she told me she has similar issues in her constituency and is particularly aggrieved by the loss of good agricultural land. And I'm aware of the concerns of members of the House of Lords too, including Lord Taylor of Holbeach, who told me of his concerns about the use of good quality agricultural land local to him for solar farms.
Well, my honourable friend,
I will give one.
I'm most grateful to her for giving way, and she's of course quite right, and the NPPF has a presumption against the use of good quality agricultural land.
Yeah.
That's not the problem. 3A is anyhow exempt from solar. The problem is slightly less good quality, 3B in particular, which in the old days the government said 3B was also banned from the for solar.
Yeah.
They've now changed their mind and they're allowing 3B to be used. So it's slightly less than good that we're looking at.
My honourable friend is right in what he says. However, actually, what I've seen across the applications that have been put in locally is that in some cases it does contain land that's of a higher grade. But two things are happening. One is that the companies are telling me that they're going to reanalyse the land to check that it really is of that grade, because after all, it might be of a much lower grade if they retest it, which, you know, the fact that they're doing their own homework does concern me as well. But also that the speculators are explaining to me that they're told that if their application contains mostly lower grade land, but they have demonstrated that there's no other land locally that they can use or is available to them, or indeed that it's in a corner or it's surrounded by panels, then they can actually use the higher grade land then too. And so it's not just land below grade 3A that's being potentially put at threat here. I give just one example as well. The Heckington Solar Farm in North Kesteven promises to power 100,000 homes, but there are only 45,000 homes in the entire area of North Kesteven. Surely it's unfair to expect this area, which already punches well above its weight in terms of food production, to also provide much more than its fair share of electricity. After all, the NFU estimate that the total land used for solar farms at present is no more than 20,000 hectares. If the 12 proposed farms in Lincolnshire all went ahead, they would cover 9,109 hectares, increasing the land used in the whole country by almost 50%. There is the impression, and this comes back to my honourable friend's point, there is the impression given by some that Class 3B land is not particularly good for farming. But that's not true. 3B land can in fact support a wide variety of crops. In Lincolnshire, such land is often flat and relatively easy to cultivate, and it's also being very easily accessible to roads. When we're facing continual food inflation and a growing global population, by over 40 million so far this year, this land is needed more than ever. Now is not the time to be increasing our carbon footprint by importing yet more food. I've heard arguments made in favour of large solar farms, so that they're occasionally used for grazing sheep or for beekeeping. I'm concerned that these are mere token gestures. They do not compensate for the damage done to the wider environment, and transitory animals such as deer have their routes blocked. This would not be such a problem if a solar farm covered only one field, but one proposed site in my patch covers 1,400 hectares or 5.4 square miles. Mistaking glass for water, birds and bats can be killed when they land on the hot panels. Perhaps worst of all, the presence of solar panels limits the potential for biodiversity due to the persistent shadow cast in the creation of set channels by rainwater runoff without proper dispersal. I don't speak as someone who's against solar power in principle, but I speak as someone desperately concerned that the character of our beautiful countryside could be completely altered by continual rows of glass panels, sometimes stretching for miles and miles. I also speak as someone concerned for her constituents, who do not seem to be given adequate say in projects which ultimately affect them the most. There is a great deal we can do to transition to greener energy, but surely there is a better alternative to industrialising our countryside. In the UK, we have 600,000 acres of south-facing industrial roof space currently unused. Prioritising industrial, residential and brownfield land for solar farms is a step in the right direction. The large Bentley factory in Crewe, with its roofs all coated in solar panels, is a brilliant example of this. It produces on average 75% of Bentley's daytime electricity demands, or the equivalent of more than 2,300 homes a year, all without using as much as a square metre of productive, beautiful agricultural land. It is perhaps fitting that the proposal near Auburn and Thorpe-on-the-Hill looks like someone standing and throwing a shot put ball, since it will throw a wrecking ball through the area if the ministers do not stop these applications from going ahead.
Question is that this House has considered planning and solar farms. I don't intend to put a formal time limit on, but members can see how many of you are standing. Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Newton. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I would like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Sleaford and North Hickham for securing this very important debate. The issue of solar farms and planning is a really good one to raise, because it's obvious to us all today that we've got to shift away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. I don't think anybody is going to demur from that. It also has the great advantage, besides the environmental benefits and saving the planet, of cutting people's bills. And again, nobody would wish to argue against that either. The Honourable Member for Sleaford and North Hickham talks about how sometimes it can feel like all of the solar panels in the country are in her Lincolnshire constituency. And I can assure her that's not right, because we've got stacks of them in my part of Devon. If we take, for example, Hawkchurch, which is a village in my constituency that borders Dorset and Somerset, this small parish is already home to over 100 acres of... I will give way.
Whilst I recognise that he's advocating passionately for his constituency, I would point out that over 50% of all land nationally currently under proposal for solar plants is in Lincolnshire, Leicestershire and Rutland. So actually we are significantly disproportionately at threat from this.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Member for her point. I mean, we've heard that there are 6,300 acres nationally of roof space on which these solar panels could be put, and I think that's an excellent point to make. And certainly for some of the people who live in my constituency, it can feel like the solar panels are concentrated in some quite small areas. What tends to happen, I think, is that when it comes to approving renewable energy projects, not just solar, but also onshore wind, they hit a roadblock, they get stuck in limbo, and I think that does tend to happen, which is why this can drag on and become a real scourge on our communities as both the developer and the local people battle it out. But for sure, if you go out and buy a new Ordnance Survey map today, what you'll see is something that you wouldn't have found 20 years ago, and that is many new solar farms, as they're called, on the map. I'm not a big fan of the term solar farm, because to me, a farm is for producing food, not for producing electricity. But we know that solar and wind are two of the quickest and the cheapest forms of sustainable energy. And that if we're to reach net zero, we do need a joined-up plan for connecting our existing power grid to renewable sources of energy. Solar accounts for just 5% of total electricity output, compared with about 27% for the generation from wind. These solar schemes that are awaiting construction would, between them, generate 15,000 megawatts per day. That's enough to power 1.9 million homes. So we can see enormous numbers of solar that are in the planning stage but have not yet been approved. And I mean, if I can think about how that could affect people in my part of the world, one enormous solar farm between Tallerton and Wimpole near my constituency would power 12,000 homes. One thing I think we should think about as people are increasingly transitioning away from heating their homes with oil over to heating their homes with methods using electricity is that we don't only need to think about power generation, but we also need to think more about insulation. And it is the case that in 2012, the government was insulating 2.3 million homes per year, whereas now that number is fewer than 100,000 homes per year. So let's not always think about how we can generate more, but also how we can conserve electricity. Two of the main challenges around advancing plans for solar is, number one, how we plug into the national grid, and secondly, how we can address concerns arising from local communities. And I absolutely hear the point about how this can be prized agricultural land that can appear to be lost under these solar panels. If we could also think about the effect on local communities, it's not only the site. I mean, I think sometimes people get a little bit bound up with what solar panels look like. It's also the sustained level of HGV traffic. And to maintain these panels, obviously there's a lot of traffic back and forth as well. So we do have to properly address those concerns from local communities to ensure that we don't hold up all solar panels and all solar renewable energy in this country. I will give way, yeah.
For his extremely interesting speech. Perhaps he'd clarify something for me. Are the Liberal Democrats in general, and he in particular, in favour of solar panels on agricultural land or opposed to it?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. The Liberal Democrats in general, and I in particular, am very much in favour of renewable energy. Very much so. I'm very happy to put that on the record. What I would like to add about solar in particular is that I do think that some of the proposals for planned solar farms, as they're called, are too large, and we need to distribute and disperse these renewable energy projects so that they don't take up vast tracts of land as they are in my constituency. In rural areas like Devon, I'd be delighted, yeah.
I was going to ask the same question my honourable friend asked, but I think just to clarify a little more there. So is he saying then that he's against large solar developments on prime land, or that he's against that, or is he saying that he wants many more of them? He says he wants to spread them. So he'd like to see many more applications in many more places, presumably, of smaller solar farms eating up agricultural land.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. Certainly, I am in favour of more and more distributed solar energy generation. And what I am not in favour of is some of these enormous, massive solar complexes that we see, including in my part of Devon, where there is an absolutely enormous amount foisted on some sometimes very small communities. One more time, yeah, certainly.
He's using up his time. I'm right in thinking then what he's talking about is a great many more solar farms, albeit smaller ones. So will he be sending a message to Devon County Council that in his particular constituency, he would welcome a large number of more smaller, up to 200 acre perhaps, solar farms rather than the bigger ones which are currently proposed? Is that what he's saying?
Well, again, I'm grateful to the honourable member for seeking clarification. I mean, I won't be writing to Devon County Council because that's not the local authority charged with planning. But certainly the local authorities that in my patch that are charged with planning know that I'm in favour, in general terms, of renewable energy generation, but I'm not in favour of the concentration of solar farms that we're seeing in particular parts of my patch. My final point is, when it comes to the planning process, we need to think about the lifespan of these projects. we are seeing enormous technological development. The way that solar PV, but also battery technology has moved on in recent decades is really staggering. And so what we mustn't do is handcuff ourselves to technology that very quickly becomes out of date. And instead, what we need to do is to make sure that these things, when they are built at a small scale, are built using A, the latest technology, and B, in such a way that if new technology comes along, we can retrofit it to make sure that these are the most efficient methods of producing renewable electricity that we can possibly have. To sum up, if we're going to invest in schemes like this, they need a lifespan that is not too long, and we need sustainable renewable energy solutions that work with farmers and with local communities so that we can take people with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Noakes. Everybody is in favour of having renewable energy, and there's no harm in having some solar farms. It's the sheer scale in Lincolnshire and in Leicestershire that was what we're talking about. We have, ringing the small town of Gainsborough, 10,000 acres of applications, marked here in the red and black. This is ludicrous overdevelopment. I mean, in a large rural district like West Lindsey, covering perhaps up to 600 square miles, if you could distribute, say, 1,000 acres, that's the offer, that would be reasonable. But 10,000 acres ringing one town is just ridiculous overdevelopment. And the point I want to make is that these applications, when it comes to a public inquiry, and there should be a public inquiry, must be taken as one, because developers are trying to have their cake and eat it. On the one hand, they say these are nationally significant infrastructure projects, which is, they say that because they simply want to bypass local opinion. That's the only reason. They want to bypass the whole planning process. They say they're significantly national projects. Therefore, they must be considered by Whitehall rather than by the local authority. That's their point of view. Although when Tony Blair brought in this sort of new planning, it was designed for nuclear power stations and that sort of thing. It wasn't designed for one little company making numerous applications and then subverting the local planning process. But on the other hand, and this is where the devil comes into all this, on the other hand, they are dividing these projects into separate applications. So one of my constituents has noted that some developers submit multiple applications, but under the same project management team. All three of the developers in our part of England are using the same law firm. When the department is considering these applications, it must consolidate them as one to look at them as a whole. And I don't think any fair public inquiry would allow 10,000 acres ringing one town, as long as they are consolidated as one. But they're trying to pick us off one by one. We all know that if approved, they would result in the loss of thousands of acres of good farmland. And this is at a time, as we know, when food distribution networks worldwide have been turned upside down by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. I mean, even this week, since the latest attack on the Crimean Bridge, Russia has said it is suspending the agreement which would allow grain to be exported through the Black Sea. Our own national planning policy framework presumes against approval of applications that would build on highly graded agricultural land. That is because Britain's food security is one of the utmost importance. And I'm sure when the Minister replies to the debate, he will say, we don't want to build solar panels on good agricultural land. So yes, we all know that this protection applies to grade 1, 2 and 3A. We've got to extend the exemption, Minister, to 3B as well. You can talk to any farmer, and my honourable friend is married to a farmer, she knows this issue more than anybody else. You can talk to any farmer in Lincolnshire, and for wheat and grain and barley, it is pretty much exactly the same quality of land to grow on. Any farmer will tell you that. And they're going around these solar companies trying to so-called analyse the land to prove it's 3B. Well, nobody in the past has cared whether it's 3A or 3B. The whole thing is a con and a cheat. And I think it's also worrying, frankly, that there's some evidence that there's Chinese backing for some of these companies. All of this is made in China. So, I mean, what are we playing at? Opposition to these projects is both broad and deep. I've had objections from parish councils of Brampton, Brattleby, Broxham, Burton, Cammeringham, Fillingham, Glentworth, Ingham, Kexby, Nath, Martin and Gate, Burton, Saxby with Ingleby, Scampton, Springthorpe, Stowe, Sturton-by-Stowe, Upton and Willingham. The visual impact, if you look, this is the cliff, which runs all the way down the centre of Lincolnshire. If you look from the cliff, if all these applications are granted, you would see a sea of black. Instead of seeing this unique farmland stretching away to the Trent and perhaps all the way to the Pennines, you would see a sea of black. The developers have offered almost nothing in terms of community gain. There is a threat of good usable farmland that we've heard all about. Building solar farms on this land undermines farming as a profession and the agricultural sector as a whole. Farming is a challenging, all-consuming and difficult calling in life. It's incredibly rewarding for those involved in it and absolutely necessary for the lifeblood of the country. Now, as we've heard, Lincolnshire is a breadbasket of England. We'd like it to stay that way. But covering 10,000 acres around one town is not the way to do this. You could feed, for these applications I've talked about, 2 cities the size of Hull for a whole year on that much land. These panels would stand 4.7 metres tall. Now, tenant farmers, and I've known tenant farmers been on the land for 200 years, farming perhaps 200 or 300 acres, who are going to be thrown off their land. You know, they have absolutely no rights. These landowners can come in and throw them off. And this land they've been farming for generations. But who gets all the benefits? I've got nothing against large landowners. Unfortunately, I'm not one myself. I would love to be a large landowner. We have many large landowners in Lincolnshire. I mean, to be fair to them, they're good people. They're already quite well off already. They are going to get fantastic rewards. It is staggering, the rewards that you get as a landowner. Yes?
It may vary between different landowners, but talking to those in my constituency, which I should say, although my husband is a farmer, does not include him because he's not planning on a solar farm. He's not to my knowledge. The amount that's been offered is more than you'd get for perhaps farming it, and it does take out the risk of bad weather or such things. But equally, after tax, the difference is not so great. And in actual fact, the money is going into the speculating companies, those prospectors who are approaching landowners to rent their land from them.
Yeah, I'm very worried about where these companies come from. They've just all grown up very suddenly, and there's huge financial resources for them. I suspect that they're not very interested in Lincolnshire. They're based in London by a group of entrepreneurs. They're going to make shed loads of money and then sell the planning application on. They don't care a damn about us. Yeah.
When I came to the I'm grateful to my friend giving way. I assumed the renewable industry would be full of people like Richard Branson and the Good family. Remember the Goods in The Good Life? The people interested in keeping goats in their garden and doing a lot of composting. In fact, they were the kind of people who drove flashy sports cars and the week before selling double glazing. So it's really clear that this is not about the environment. This is not about renewable energy. This is about getting rich quick.
Yeah. In that brief period of the Liz Truss government, the then Secretary of State did try and change the definition to include 3B. And there was just a mountain of hugely well-funded lobbying money immediately put in there to frustrate the whole process. Make no mistake, this is not about the countryside. It's not about producing green energy in the right way, in a controlled way. It is about money. And some people are going to get very rich indeed. So solar power has a vital part to play. But solar panels belong in moderate amounts, maybe, on poor agricultural land and atop buildings and on brownfield sites, not on good farmland. Put them on top of large logistics centres we see at the side of our motorways. Stick them on top of factories and industrial buildings. Put them on schools and houses by all means. But good land needs to be kept in agricultural use. We need to... Yes, one last time.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, can I commend the Honourable Lady for bringing this forward and commend the Honourable Gentleman and his contributions. Just to add the example, if I can, Madam Chair, in Northern Ireland there are small examples where solar farms have been integrated and small farms where sheep are able to graze. I know a couple of examples of that in my own constituency, but the place where solar farms have been agreed to are in land that has been industrial land. It's not been possible to do anything with. Land that's maybe been corroded with, say, lead mines or something like that. Those are the places for the solar farms, the best places, and keep the productive land, as the Ulster Farmers Union want to have for farming.
Yeah. Industry always responds to subsidies. I can't understand why the government doesn't create a new subsidy regime where it is so much in your benefit if you build a massive warehouse to put a solar panel on top of it. I think that's something they could do. So let's keep these solar panels off good agricultural land. Let's have them in proportion, and I very much hope the Minister will respond positively to this important debate.
Eric Thomas.
Thank you very much, Chairman Notes, Caroline. Shall I get my notes together? I might come across as taking a slightly different view, but actually that's absolutely not why I'm here. I represent a beautiful part of the world. There's not a massive amount of housing going on in my part of the world. There's not a huge population. There is a huge amount of countryside. There's lots of farmland that is very good for productive land. Natural England, God bless them, have just taken a huge amount of farmland out of production for a triple SI. We must recognise that the pressure on the land squeeze isn't just about renewable energy. But I come at this at a slightly different angle in that actually reform of policy allows us, as we've just heard actually, to get solar in the right place and delivering the right thing for our communities and addressing the cost of energy and the pressure on energy security. And I just want to do a bit of kind of the kind of context. I mean, the size of the prize, as we heard in the Chris Gidmore Mission Zero report to the upside opportunity for net zero, is likely to be over £1 trillion by the 2030s, a generational economic growth opportunity in relation to renewable energy. The downside risk stemming from current issues in the UK planning, grid and the wider investment climate is potentially £62 billion of missed investment in the same period. Now, this isn't £62 billion of solar farms all over our beautiful green and pleasant countryside. It's about £60 billion of investment that really allows it in the right place, as I've said, and I want to touch that a bit later on. The risk is crystallising in part due to the negative global headwinds that are adversely affecting the UK. They've been mentioned. The post-COVID inflation, the war in Ukraine, but also actual or proposed policy decisions that have been deeply unpopular with investors. For example, the energy generator levy and the continued issues with planning. Now, whilst the ELG was a negative indication to the markets, the more important issues pertaining to planning are holding up solar projects being connected to the UK grid, slowing our transition to net zero and harming our ability to secure national energy security. Now, further, this is impacting a crucial partner in solar generation that often goes forgotten, and we've referred to them today. These are the farmers and landowners, and I've heard the comments about posh Land Rovers and very wealthy landowners. That isn't the case in my neck of the woods. Farmers are not extraordinarily rich. They haven't made a huge amount of money on just using the lands for other things than producing food. But actually what they are able to do by putting renewable energy infrastructure, solar farms and other stuff such as mobile connectivity on their land in the right place where the land isn't productive in any way, certainly isn't worth working, then actually that has helped that farm to survive. And we all of us know here, that if farms aren't viable, they are broken up, they're sold off, and then you do get the very rich Chelsea tractor drivers coming into beautiful parts of the countryside and not looking after, maybe having hobby farms or estates that don't really protect the countryside.
Thank you, young gentleman, for giving way. He talks about small-scale connections. One of the things that's driving against small-scale connections is the price of those connections.
That's right.
And the price of those connections is determined by the electric companies. And in fact, they are driving people towards the massive scale because it's the only way to make the connection commercially viable.
That is exactly right, and that's what I wanted to come on to, which I was hesitant about appearing to take a different view to the rest of the room. That is exactly the thing, and I don't think it's not just about the suppliers that's driving up the force of the smaller scale solar installations. It's also the planning process. By going through the NSIP route, the cost of that, I'm told, can be £10 million to get that permission. Now, if you're going to spend that kind of money on a solar farm, and I agree that the term is dreadful, if you're going to spend that kind of money, you can absolutely understand why they then go for huge solar installations, whereas actually it's because of the cost of that through that route that makes these so concentrated and on such scale. That would never be delivered in Cornwall. But at the moment, you have to. I think the site is limited to 50 megawatts if you want to use the traditional, what we would call the traditional Town and Countryside Planning Act, which is actually much healthier for the local community to engage in, much easier for them to have their say and for the right solution to be raised. So I would actually suggest that in this debate, some of the consideration must be given about whether that needs to be reformed to allow slightly bigger sites to be used without having to go through the NSIP route. And the reason I say that is because actually land use planning is the key to all of this. We do need, and there's lots of work happening in the Lords and by government and lots of conversation around how do we plan the use of land in our countryside for housing, for transport, for growing food, for producing energy, for caring for the natural environment. That work must accelerate. That work is the best possible tool to deliver the energy we need, the food we need, the environment, the natural environment enhanced, but actually do it in a way that works with communities and that, yes, certainly, works with communities in everyone's interest.
I'm most grateful, my honourable friend, for giving way, and he's, of course, absolutely right. The more of these things that can be decided at the local level, the better it will be. But we're talking about sites of up to 200 acres, it's actually quite large, particularly a place like Cornwall. And secondly, the fact of the matter is that if there's a presumption in favour of solar, as exists in government policy, and if counties like Cornwall or Wiltshire have a target they have to achieve, the local authorities have a presumption they will allow solar farms, and because they know that if they're turned down, they go to the inspector will allow them. And therefore, having the local authority deciding it is not necessarily a solution.
I hear that, and we were all hopeful, and maybe still hopeful, that the Levelling Up Regeneration Bill might address some of the opportunities for the inspector. But I do hear that, and I think the call for proper reform and understanding about where solar fits in a whole land use planning is the key to it. I absolutely agree. We need a proper plan for how land is used and what kind of land is available for what kind of purpose. But can I just say there's one more thing that is kind of the elephant in the room, and that is grid capacity. And when we look at planning, when we look at solar installations, surely it's better to look at where there is grid capacity, where the land can be made available for it, and prioritise those areas. We are all committed to moving away from fossil fuels. We all recognise that we've got to have energy security and reduce the cost of energy. We can do that through renewable energy. We've shown in Cornwall for a long time we were the leading county for onshore renewable energy. That's been stolen from us, partly to grid capacity. But actually the clever move is to understand what land use is really about, what needs to be, how we identify what should be on that land, but also where the capacity is, and that includes grid capacity and the quality of land. Yes, certainly.
Thank you. I wonder if I could push on the issue of grid capacity, because one of the things that's driving the problem in my constituency is that we had a problem with grid capacity. The grid have upgraded a substation, and as such, the entire for several miles around the substation, it's all open to applications for solar panels. So that's what's driving these massive applications that destroy the countryside.
I hear that, and I don't have an answer for it, and thankfully I'm not the minister. But I completely hear that, and I do understand the tension. I'm arguing, maybe, I hope not. I'm actually arguing that there's a real danger, as I think we did with onshore wind, and I don't object to onshore wind in the right place, where we create such a situation where these things can't happen at all, and then we actually hinder the right kind of development, the right kind of movement in the right direction. Now, we have the opportunity of Celtic Sea where we are now, and a huge amount of offshore wind, which I think is a much better solution. But I still think that grid capacity, land use, and reform of planning that understands and recognises everything that's been said stops this gold rush for something that actually doesn't deliver anything for food or for our countryside that is going to help us feel that we can enjoy green and pleasant land as we should. I still think that we mustn't cut off the nose to spite the face when it comes to delivering energy as close to home as possible to meet our constituents' needs. That's really what I'm getting at. And local community network is quite an important thing in this debate. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I don't intend to impose a formal time limit, but a countdown clock on 7 minutes informally, just to be helpful to members. Alicia Kearns.
Thank you ever so much, and it's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship. I thank the member for Sleaford and North Hykeham for securing this important debate. It is, as I said earlier, no coincidence that many of us speaking in this chamber today represent Rutland, Leicestershire or Lincolnshire, which has been historically known as the breadbasket of England. It has fed our nation for centuries. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing a concentration of solar developments in those areas, with over 50% of all land nationally proposed for solar plants being in Lincolnshire and bordering counties. And perhaps colleagues might wish to adopt that language of solar plants, because that is what they are. I worry that this does not bode well for our national food security when the heartlands of our agriculture are being assaulted. At my last count, there were 77 solar plants currently proposed in Lincolnshire and bordering counties that total over 38,000 acres of land in just our corner of our great country. In Rutland Melton alone, we have solar plant proposals or in place in Exton, Ryle, Essendine, Ragdale, Barkston, Plunger, Ketton, Ranksborough, Pilton, Musson, Upping and Belmsthorpe, let alone the nearby Stamford villages such as Carblies, Braceborough and Casewig. It is unacceptable that we are seeing this assault on our local planning infrastructure. DEFRA is very clear in its guidance that grade 3A and above best and most versatile farmland should not be used for energy projects. Solar Energy UK say that solar plants generally utilise previously developed land, such as brownfield sites and land of lower agricultural quality. But this is simply not true, and here are a few examples by geographical location. In Bassetlaw, 100% of all solar plants are on BMV land. In Scruton, 97% are on best and most fertile land. In Drax, 94%. Shropshire, 97%. Campbellsford, 94%. Old Malton, 60%. That is and cannot be right. In my own constituency of Rutland and Melton, we have a proposal for a 2,000-acre Mallard Pass solar plant, which is made up of, yes, just 6% Grade 1 land, but 47% Grade 2A land and 47% Grade 3B land. If it goes ahead, we will lose 2,000 acres of productive farmland. If we are serious about food security, we cannot allow this to happen, because if it does, by 2050, only 9.2% of land classifying as BMV will still be under cultivation for food purposes. Everyone needs to stand by the protection of our farmland, and that's why, to make it a reality, I'm calling on DEFRA to make its guidance against energy project as BMV land legally binding, and I will be tabling a clause to the energy bill to prevent BMV land from excessive solar development. I hope that all honourable members in the chamber today will come and sign that amendment to make clear that we need to put this into law. I also want to touch briefly, in reverse to the comments of many colleagues, on solar developers essentially making a mockery of our planning process by putting in proposals for 49.9 megawatts to avoid the scrutiny of being over 50 megawatts in a nationally significant infrastructure project. From my own research, I've discovered one developer, Econ Energy, with 2 applications for solar plants in the UK, one in Rutland, claiming when they go to the planning authorities that they will produce just 49.9 megawatts. Yet when I went onto their website and into their internal presentations that apparently are for shareholders only, but they seem to have put them online, these developments are listed as generating 80 megawatts and 53 megawatts. So essentially they are going to the local planning system in the pretext that they will produce 49.9 when they are not, and they have no intention of doing so. And this suggests foul play. If solar developers are playing the system to avoid scrutiny, they must be punished by the planning inspectorate just as any person would if they broke planning laws. And I've given these documents to the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing Communities to ask for an urgent investigation because due process must be followed. I also want to call on the government to act over forced Uyghur labour in solar supply chains. The US and the EU have both taken concrete actions to protect their markets from goods that are produced by Uyghur slaves, yet we have done nothing. Consequently, we are now a dumping ground for goods made with Uyghur slave labour, making a mockery of our modern slavery laws, and a vote in this House where we said that the persecution of the Uyghur is a genocide. From June to November 2022, over 1,000 shipments of solar panels from China were seized by the United States due to their links with Uyghur forced labour. Not one shipment has been seized in the UK. Canadian Solar, the developers behind the proposed Mallard Pass solar plant in Rutland, are one of the worst offenders. Not only have their supplies been sanctioned by the US government, they've had shipments seized. They're now being done for tariff dodging because they put their products through Thailand, hoping the US authorities wouldn't notice that they were originally made in China. They were named in the Sheffield-Hallam report as guilty of being complicit in genocide, and even their own shareholders tried to deselect their board over links to forced labour. They then called my office and said, what would Alicia like to drop her opposition to our solar plant? We'd love to know what she would like in return for this. No, I will not be bought off, and I hope that none of my Lib Dem-led council are meeting with Canadian Solar and having similar conversations. So I ask, why is this organisation, Canadian Solar, allowed to apply to build nationally significant infrastructure in our country, and why is the government taking no action? Something here is not right, and if the government won't act, I ask members to back me and back the other clause that I will be tabling to the energy bill, where I will insulate our market from panels tainted by Uyghur blood and other forms of forced labour. Solar will be an important part of our push for net zero, and that's what we in Rutland want. But we will not have it at any price, and communities in Rutland and the Stamford villages will not accept blood-tainted products. To ensure Solar's contribution is truly a positive one, I am calling on the government to make guidance against building energy projects on B&V land legally binding. I'm asking them to urgently investigate solar developers misrepresenting their applications as generating only 49.9 megawatts and punish any offenders. And I'm asking them to follow the US and EU in finally blocking solar imports made with Uyghur forced labour as part of genocide, because to fail to act would be immoral. Thank you, Chair.
Sir John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Noakes. It's a great pleasure to speak in this debate, and I congratulate my honourable friend for securing it. And like her, I take a profound interest, as she will know, and certainly my right honourable friend from Gainsborough knows, in all matters that concern the great county of Lincolnshire. And they are right to say that Lincolnshire is disproportionately affected by this. And similarly, Lincolnshire is disproportionately the area which grows much of the food which is consumed across our country, which fills shop shelves and pantries in homes. And so it's right that we take a profound interest in the use of the land there to grow the crops we need to assure our country's energy security. Now, I want to speak about three things in this brief but telling intervention: energy, the environment and agriculture. First of all, energy. When I was the energy minister, I discovered three things. Firstly, that it is critical for any country's energy policy to have an energy mix. Some baseload energy of the kind that's provided with nuclear power, some flexible energy that can respond to changing patterns of demand. Because the demand for energy is unpredictable. Of course, it's true, we heat our homes more in the winter, and we like them too, but we can get sudden surges of demand in a particularly cold snap, for example. So you need flexible energy provision of the kind provided, for example, by gas. Now, renewables are an important part of that mix. They don't have the flexibility of the fossil fuels, but they are important in delivering our ambitions in respect of carbon emissions. But renewables are not a good per se. They need to be in the right places and delivering the right volume of energy. And in those terms, when I was the energy minister and later Downing Street and in the Cabinet Office, I was partly responsible for the moratorium on onshore wind. What that had the effect of doing was, although I wouldn't want to suggest, Madam Chairman, that I knew this at the time, I wasn't prophetic. It had the effect of driving wind power offshore and catalysed the extraordinary success of our offshore wind industry. Because when the developers couldn't build onshore, they looked to how they could maximise offshore production and develop the specialisms in doing so, which became world-beating. Offshore wind is infinitely preferable to onshore wind for many reasons. Firstly, because the volume, the size of the turbines, the number of turbines, the amount of energy you can produce. And secondly, because you only have a single point of transmission back to the grid rather than multiple points of transmission. And that brings me to solar, because solar is much the same. Important, but needs to be in the right place. And solar should, for the most part, be on buildings. It is extraordinary that we drive around our country and see a proliferation of every kind of large building, particularly warehouses, without a solar panel anywhere near them. And yet, simultaneously, we have these applications for large-scale solar farms on prime agricultural land. By prime, I mean grade 1, grade 2, grade 3A and grade 3B. Even grade 4 land actually is not entirely unproductive. But certainly in Lincolnshire, where there is a great deal of grade 1, 2 and 3 land, it is preposterous to, on that very land, which could be making more of the food that our country needs, to put these huge solar developments. So I say to the Minister, who I know is sensitive to these subjects, I met him recently, discussed them, and I know that he's an extremely good and diligent member of this government, that we really need to refocus our efforts to develop on building solar. Successive governments, I think, have been inadequate in that respect. Now a word about the environment. Now the environment and an interest in the climate are related but not synonymous. Of course the climate affects the environment, but the environment is more than just the climate. And the environment is a matter of ergonomics, but it's also a matter of aesthetics. We either want to preserve what my honourable friend called our green and pleasant land, we either believe in our landscape and its use, or we don't. And I do, frankly. I want our countryside to continue to be productive and beautiful. And why shouldn't we make a case for beauty? I've been doing so about buildings for years, so let me now do so about our landscape, about our countryside. And do we really want to continue to industrialise the countryside? And people say to me, oh, well, these solar developments won't last long. How long? And why wouldn't they simply put another application in at the end of the life of the solar development? And as far as onshore wind's concerned, it's not the turbine itself, it's the concrete which anchors it, which will last forever. And so solar panels on buildings are essential in order to protect our environment. And the third thing I want to talk about is agriculture. Colleagues across the House understand that a combination, as my right honourable friend Gainsborough said, of the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine has refocused attention to how we can be more secure, both in energy and in food production, actually. This is the delight to those of us who wanted to protect our economy for years, like him and I, because we've started to see the liberal obsession with free trade unravel, and that's a very good thing. But in essence, what this means is that whereas over our lifetimes the proportion of food we produce in this country has declined, we used to make more of the food that we consume here in Britain, we now need to move in the opposite direction. And that won't happen if we use up all of the land for these other things. So in the 30 seconds I have left, let me say this. This is an argument about energy. It's actually an argument about much more than that too. And the Minister, I hope, will be characterised as he looks back on his legacy as being the man who for the first time took seriously our concern for the environment, our need for an appropriate energy mix, and our belief in British food for British consumers.
James Gray.
Mrs. Noakes, I have been a passionate environmentalist for most of my adult life and for most of my time here in Parliament. I went to the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro as a special advisor in 1992 and have since then been involved in almost every aspect of environmental discussions in this place. For that reason, I'm absolutely passionate about the necessity to achieve net zero by 2050. We must do it. There's no question about it. I spent a lot of time travelling in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, and I've seen the effects of global warming. There's no question about it. We must do this thing. And renewable energy, of course, is the way in which we must do it. So we should not come away from our commitment to the use of renewable energy to achieve net zero. I'm also absolutely convinced that solar supplies a very large part of that. It's by far the cheapest and by far the most effective and efficient way of producing renewable energy. So I'm a passionate supporter of solar energy too. And that should perhaps preface my remarks. However, I have a number of concerns, first of all, about solar energy itself. First, the planning permissions which have been granted are for 40 years. Now, we all know that the technology is developing at an absolutely breakneck speed. And I do not believe that the Polish solar farms that we're currently seeing across Wiltshire, and incidentally Wiltshire is the second largest solar place in the county in Britain, the solar farms that are developing across Wiltshire, I do not believe that in 40 years' time they will still be there. What will happen is that they will be removed. We will then have those sites being brownfield sites, and they'll be replaced by something equally obnoxious. The notion that they'll go back to productive farmland, I find extremely unlikely. That's perhaps compounded by the fact that much of this activity is, as some of my honourable friends have said, is a complex financial shenanigan. These are Wall Street and Chinese financial companies who are investing in this business because they know it's enormously profitable. They couldn't care less about renewables. They couldn't care less about agriculture. They couldn't care less about Britain. They do care about making a substantial buck out of it. And we have to look into the way in which these things are funded. We have to look into the way in which these companies are who pays for them, and who's getting the profits from it. And that's, I think, an important point. We're a bit short on time, of course.
Alicia Cairns.
Just exactly that point, Canadian Solar, the company I mentioned earlier, which I'm sure the Foreign Office, now the PPS is here for that department, will report back, needs to be sanctioned urgently. They are not Canadian. In fact, they are a Chinese company, Chinese-run, based in China, pretending to be Canadian. I wonder why they would not choose a Chinese name for their business.
She's, of course, quite right. So we're concerned about the technology. It won't last. We're concerned about the 40-year planning permission that's been granted. We're concerned about who stands behind it. But I'm also very concerned in a technical sense about battery storage units. These solar farms are no use at all because the use of energy fluctuates during the day. And therefore you have to have these very substantial and hideously ugly battery support units in order to make them work. Now these things are ugly, they're huge, dangerous, many of them burst into flame spontaneously, and a very large question exists with regard to their technology. And I think we must be very careful indeed about the way we use this stuff for that reason alone. Second, Mrs. Noakes, I think my honourable friends have made a very important point about food security. Post-Ukraine, we are deeply worried about who is going to feed us in Britain and who is going to feed the world. And it strikes me as being morally quite wrong to be covering good agricultural land. The 3B is good agricultural land, covering it with vanity mirrors being paid for by overseas investors. That seems to me to be morally unacceptable. Morally, it simply can't be sustained. So the food production versus energy security argument is a potent one. And, of course, the very simple answer to the energy security one comes, as my honourable friends have said, from putting solar farms or solar panels off agricultural land. I'm proud of the fact that in my own constituency, I both RAF Lynham, which is the largest solar farm in Europe. It's huge, absolutely enormous, can't be seen by anybody. It's on former military land. The same applies to Wroughton, just outside my constituency, where, again, one of the largest solar farms in Europe on entirely unproductive land. Absolutely fine. But why are we having a spate of applications right across North Wiltshire for 200-acre or 300-acre sites, grade 3B, been used for years for production of wheat and of grass, indeed, in the West Country? That's very important with regard to dairy. Been used for donkey's years to do that, and all of a sudden, because it's 3B, because these companies are going around proving it's 3B, somehow or another there's a presumption in favour of them getting the application. And that brings me on to the final point with regard to I'm rather short time, my honourable friend. She'll have a moment to reply in a moment. That brings me on to my final point with regard to my honourable friend's particular debate, which is the planning system. In Wiltshire, we have found, Wiltshire, I say, is the second largest county in England. We have hundreds of these things, applications right now. We've found that the government have laid down targets for the county, and therefore the planning officers very correctly say to the planning committee, if you turn this down, as you may well want to turn it down, it will without question go to appeal, the inspector will without question allow it, and the barrister's fees for the public inquiry will be down to the county. And therefore, by having a target for renewables on the county, it means there's a huge presumption in favour of the local authority allowing it. That must be turned round. Now, I'd like to see, when the National Policy Framework comes forward later this year, I'd like to see two things in it, really. First of all, I'd like to see a return to days when 3B agricultural land was presumption against using 3B. And that was the case. When my honourable friend, George Eustace, whose constituency I can't remember, that's precisely what I said, if I may say so, Mr. Noakes. I couldn't remember his constituency, therefore I was hoping that I'd be assisted. Corn, my honourable friend Cornwall. Campbell Redruth appeared in front of the Environmental Audit Committee on which I serve. He made it plain that, in his view, 3B land was included in the presumption against. It would be in the NPPF when that comes up. He then had to write to me to correct that. Officials made him correct that particular point. Now, I think we need to see, first of all, 3A and 3B. Secondly, we need to find some new way of applying the planning law so there's no longer this presumption in favour of the developer. We must find a way of presuming against the developer, presume in favour of preserving our green and pleasant land, presume a way of presumption in favour of food security rather than energy security, and a way of finding a way of putting these solar installations not on agricultural land but on large-scale industrial land and on previously used military land of the kind that I described. We are in the process of concreting over our countryside for these things, covering them in totally unproductive mirrors, covering them in a way that will never be reversed. This won't go back. We won't be seeing going back to agricultural land. We're risking saying to our future generations, we did this to your countryside, blame us for it.
Thank you, Mrs Noakes. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair and to respond to what has been a genuinely interesting and thought-provoking debate. I congratulate the Honourable Lady, the member for Sleaford and North Hykeham on securing the debate, and I thank all the Honourable members who have participated this afternoon. Mrs Noakes, last year was the UK's warmest on record and one of the 6 warmest years ever recorded globally. The record-breaking temperatures we experienced last summer, including our first ever 40-degree day, caused an unprecedented number of heat-related deaths, wildfire incidents and disruption to infrastructure. And yet the occasionally severe weather we experienced last year is only a foretaste of what is to come, unless our country plays its full part in decisively slowing the rate of global heating to prevent it reaching catastrophic levels. And on that, I think the room is ostensibly agreed. The science is, as we all know, unequivocal. Bold action is required, and it is required now. However, when it comes to the UK's net zero emissions target, this government has consistently been long on aspiration, but short on tangible progress. The UK's nationally determined contribution requires emissions reductions of 68% by 2030, compared with 1990 levels. And the government's 6th carbon budget requires them to be slashed by 78 by 2035. Yet in their June 2023 progress report, the Climate Change Committee state plainly that their confidence in the achievement of both targets has, and I quote, markedly declined from last year. Put simply, Mrs Noakes, the overall pace of climate delivery under this government remains woefully inadequate. If our country is to meet its interim targets, reduce its dependence on fossil fuels and lower energy bills for consumers, the government needs to do far better, including when it comes to the domestic deployment of established low-cost technologies such as solar. Having over recent years subjected solar to a series of erratic policy changes and reductions in support, including slashing rates for the feed-in tariff scheme in 2015, the British Energy Security Strategy, published in April last year, finally provided a welcome measure of certainty, committing the government, as it does, to a 5-fold increase in solar deployment by 2035, taking levels from the current 14 gigawatts of capacity, the bulk of which is ground-mounted, to 70 gigawatts. The government have also been clear as to the scale of solar deployment that is likely to be necessary to meet the UK's wider net zero targets, with the technical annex to the Powering Up Britain policy paper published in March, suggesting that approximately 90 gigawatts of solar will ultimately be necessary. And yet, Mrs Noakes, last year saw just 0.7 gigawatts of new solar deployed, a rate of installation that falls well short of what is required to meet the government's own target. As the Climate Change Committee stated in the 2023 progress report I previously mentioned, and I quote, the deployment of solar capacity is significantly off track to meet the government's target of 70 gigawatts by 2035. To get on track for that 70 gigawatt 2035 target, the committee makes clear that the government needs to facilitate the delivery of an average annual deployment rate of 4.3 gigawatts. As such, Mrs Noakes, this House can debate what the precise split should be between large-scale and smaller-scale projects, what types of land should be prioritised for solar deployment, and how we best maximise the efficiency of land that is utilised. But the only fundamental question is precisely how we markedly drive up solar deployment rates, not whether we need to. And every honourable member who is engaging, just let me finish this point if I may, every honourable member who is engaging with the debate today in good faith needs to at least have an answer as to how the extra 3.6 gigawatts of annual solar capacity implied in the government's target should be accomplished.
Sir John Hayes.
I'm grateful to Honourable John giving way. But surely he recognises that by far the best way of doing so is to put solar on buildings. Yeah. every public building, every warehouse, agricultural buildings, every office, every industrial estate could have and should have solar. And the advantage of that, of course, would be to bring energy production and consumption to closer union and reduce transmission and distribution costs, which make up about 15% of every energy bill.
Matthew Pennycook.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for that intervention. He has a lot of expertise in this area, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. And he preempts a point I will come to make, because I think we would like to certainly see, and we think the government should be far more ambitious and creative about rooftop solar, which we think can meet the bulk of our solar needs going forward. Mrs Noakes, as the House will be aware, the Labour Party have committed to delivering a zero-emission power system by 2030, 5 years ahead of the government's target date. When it comes to solar, we assess that honouring that commitment will require us to triple deployment by the end of this decade, up to 50 gigawatts of capacity. Now, we're under no illusions as to the fact that is a stretching target, but we believe it is essential to achieving zero carbon power by the end of the decade, and the Labour government will do what is necessary to meet it. Our plans are premised, as I said, on a significant uplift in solar PV deployment on rooftops, which analysis suggests could provide the bulk of that 50 gigawatts of capacity we want to be installed by 2030. And I think the room broadly is in complete agreement on that point. As I said, we would like to see the government be far more ambitious and creative about how it does that.
The honourable gentleman is setting out what he thinks the Labour government would do were they to get the chance. My right honourable friend and member for Rutland and Melton talked earlier about an amendment she wishes to bring to the energy bill, saying that grade 3A and 3B land should not be used for solar panels. Will the Labour Party support it?
Yeah, good question.
It is a good question, and I thank her for that intervention. I listened with great interest to the honourable lady's suggestion. I do think there should be greater protections for BMV land category 1 to 3A. We disagree with the honourable members on the opposite side when it comes to category 3B land. We think there is sufficient flexibility in the system that you do need 3B land in certain circumstances, and we certainly wouldn't be looking to exempt 3B land in its entirety, as been suggested by a couple of the honourable members in the debate today. However, Mrs Noakes, while we want to see the majority of solar deployment on rooftops, there is no question that we will also need to take steps to enable the deployment of far more ground-mounted solar that is presently being installed, and that will include a number of large sites. That will require reform of our planning system. We believe the planning system as a whole needs to be overhauled so that it is aligned fully with our net zero emissions target. I will give it.
What is the difference in terms of wheat production between 3A and 3B? Will you enlighten me, please?
He tempts me to stray outside of my departmental responsibilities, which I won't do. But we are, I'm afraid, in complete agreement with his own government, which says that there needs to be far more solar deployment on Category 3 brand. So he may want to take it up with the Minister outside of the debate. We believe also, Mrs Noakes, that the system needs a renewed focus on integrated spatial and infrastructure planning to ensure we are developing and using land in a strategic manner and ensuring that large, over 50 megawatt sites are appropriately distributed across the country. And I listen with great interest to the comments of the honourable member for St Ives about a land use framework, something we certainly support the direction of. We believe the planning system needs proactive and strategic renewable energy deployment to be integrated fully into local and neighbourhood plan development and for renewable deployment to feature prominently in the development plan soundness test. And we believe the system needs to speed up the process for securing planning consent for renewable generation of all kinds for projects both over and under 50 megawatts capacity. Now, that is not to say, Mrs Noakes, that we do not understand and appreciate many of the concerns that have been expressed in the debate today by honourable members. As I've already made clear, there is no question in our view that we need a more strategic and planned approach to ground-mounted solar deployment across the country. We do need to do more to drive up rates of rooftop solar installation and to prioritise solar deployment on previously developed or lower value land. We need to take steps to further maximise the efficiency of sites used for renewable deployment, co-locating infrastructure wherever possible to mitigate its impact on communities. We need environmental protections to remain in place, and we need communities to continue to have a say about where large-scale projects are best located. But ensuring we have a sensible approach to large-scale ground-mounted solar deployment does not mean that it can be an option to refuse it wholesale. I will give way one last time.
Which I'm surprised at slightly. So can I ask one gentleman, having dashed my hopes at Labour Party support for my new clause energy bill, although I will come back to you for a flip on that in a few weeks' time. What about the amendment that recognises that we should not be importing Uyghur-produced slave labour solar panels into this country? Thank you, Penny Cook.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that intervention. I hope she'll forgive me if I don't outline a front bench position on a
Please
particular
do. No,
amendment.
you do. You speak on behalf of your party, please.
On a particular amendment that is outside my departmental responsibility. But I will certainly feed the point back to my colleagues. But I think in general terms, I'm answering the Honourable Lady, in general terms, we are very concerned and share the concerns that are being expressed about supply chains in context of solar and the use of slave labour. And I've listened to her speak very eloquently on the subject many times. And we, I think, generally agree with the approach. I can't speak to the particular amendment she speaks to. As I said, Mrs. Noakes, having a sensible approach does not mean that it can be an option to refuse solar deployment at the scale that is required wholesale. It is deeply problematic in our view that rates of solar farm planning permission refusal have risen significantly over recent years. So while we are committed to ensuring communities have a say on where large-scale solar deployment should take place in their areas, and want to do more in particular to boost community participation and engagement upstream at the plan-making stage and ensure communities directly benefit from local renewable installation, we feel strongly that it is essential that the government look to address delays in the planning process and other regulatory processes, I am coming to an end, that currently present a barrier to low-carbon infrastructure installation at scale. To conclude, Mrs. Noakes, large-scale solar is safe, reliable, versatile and of overwhelming environmental benefit. It is one of the cheapest renewable generation technologies that exists and can effectively complement other more variable sources. In the global race for clean energy, it is also a particularly easy technology to deploy at scale. We need a planning system that properly engages communities in its rollout and mitigates its local impacts, but also one that enables its deployment to take place at the rate and scale we need to rapidly reduce our emissions and reap the full advantages of the green transition. That is what a Labour government intends to deliver if we get the chance to serve.
Thank you, thank you Ms. Noakes, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here under your chairmanship today and to respond to this incredibly important debate. It is incredibly important. I myself represent a vast 1,900 square mile rural constituency, and so I understand the pressures that are being felt in many of the constituencies represented in the chamber today. And so I would like to thank very much my honourable friend, the member for Sleaford and North Highcombe, for securing today's important debate. And let me say in advance that if I'm unable to answer any of her questions here today, I will get back to her at a later stage and will ensure that ministers at DLUC and DEFRA do so as well. And I would like to thank other honourable members and right honourable members for contributing today from Gainsborough, Sleaford and North Highcombe, St Ives, North Wiltshire, Penrith and the Border, Central Sutcliffe and North Ipswich, Strangford, Tiverton, Honiton, and I especially good to see one of my predecessors, the Honourable Member for Holland and the Deeping, South Holland and the Deeping. It's always nerve-wracking when one of your predecessors comes into the room, but I'd like to thank him for his kind words and assure him that he has left some big shoes to fill in the department. Firstly, I would like to assure everybody here that sustainability remains at the heart of this government's ambition for development, and that includes the protection of the environment and indeed local communities. Energy security, food security and protecting our environment are just some of the key challenges we face in the UK. Meeting these goals is urgent and of critical importance to the country, and we believe these can be achieved together for the United Kingdom. We believe that solar energy will continue to play a key role in helping to secure greater energy independence while building a more sustainable and greener future for generations to come. However, the government recognises that solar farms, as with any new infrastructure, will have local impacts. It is therefore essential that we have a robust planning system that not only helps deliver energy security, but also protects the environment and local communities and supports wider government ambitions such as food security. As several honourable members have pointed out, and has been pointed out to me in the past, we are not, nor are we able to create new prime agricultural land. The dramatic rise in global energy prices following the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has emphasised the urgency of the need to build a strong homegrown renewable energy sector, and solar energy is key to achieving this. Solar farms are one of the most established renewable energy technologies in the UK and the cheapest form of electricity generation. We have seen an increase in the number and size of developments coming forward and expect this trend to continue. So in the net zero strategy, the government committed to installing up to 70 gigawatts of solar capacity by 2035. This does represent a five-fold increase in our current capacity, and we need to maximise the deployment of all types of solar to achieve this ambitious target. It is important to stress, however, that this does not mean seizing large swathes of countryside and turning them into industrial solar farms and storage units. Yes, ground-mounted solar will be needed, but smaller-scale commercial and domestic rooftop projects, as so many members here today have pointed out, will be just as essential, if not more so. And the government believes that solar and farming can be complementary, supporting each other financially, environmentally, and through shared use of land. Therefore, we seek solar deployment across the UK, looking for deployment mainly on brownfield industrial and low-medium-grade agricultural land, and encourage solar technology that delivers environmental benefits with consideration for ongoing food production or environmental improvement. I'd like to come on to planning for solar farm developments. Before I do, I was listening with interest to my honourable friend, the Liberal Democrat spokesman, as he spoke today. And as you wouldn't have known by his contribution, I thought I would look up what Liberal Democrat policy on planning for solar farms would be. Indeed, some people listening in Somerton and Frome might be interested to learn that the Liberal Democrats' plans are to remove restrictions on new solar and wind to accelerate the deployment of renewable power across the country. So they're removing some community input into the planning process for new solar deployment. That certainly isn't the position of His Majesty's government. Planning applications for solar deployments below 50 megawatt capacity are determined by local planning authorities. So that would be, in his case, the Liberal Democrat Authority in Devon, through the Town and County Planning Act, and in accordance with the National Planning Policy Framework and relevant planning policy. I would indeed.
Dr. Danforth.
Highlighting the role of local authorities in determining some of the lower output solar farms. Now, we have in East Suffolk a Green and Liberal Democrat coalition now running the council, and they've already given both the Greens have already given the green light to developers and controversial developments in Framlingham. What reassurance can he give to my constituents that the government will make sure that controversial applications for solar farms are not green-lighted by local authorities?
In fact, I was just going to come on to the role that the government plays in the planning process in a second, but I think it's really important that local authorities, be they Liberal Democrat, Green, Conservative or Labour-run, take into consideration and listen to communities when they have expressed deep concerns about the deployment of solar farms or indeed other energy infrastructure projects that may be planned for those constituencies. And so I would urge them, those that are listening to this debate today, to hear that, and I would urge representatives of other parties who may be in control of some rural local authorities in this room to take that back to their colleagues and ensure that that is heard loud and clear. Plans over 50 megawatt capacity are decided by the Secretary of State through the Nationally Significant Infrastructure Project, that's NSIP for short, regime, in accordance with Energy National Policy Statements. There are currently no operational projects of this size in England. However, there are 23 projects currently in the planning system, with the latest, Longfield Solar Farm near Chelmsford, consented by the Secretary of State just last month, ahead of the statutory decision deadline. Yes, very happy.
The problem of clustering has been raised several times in the debate. The government recognised that as a problem. We certainly think it needs looking into. Can he give us a sense why the government didn't include the issue in its NSIP reform action plan that was published earlier this year? It was silent on the issue despite the government recognising it. Why is that?
I will endeavour to get an answer from the relevant government department to the honourable member's question, and I will ensure that gets to him as speedily as possible after the conclusion of this debate here this afternoon. Both, I, of course, would be delighted to give way.
I'm not, as far as I understand, not a single proposal has been turned down as yet by the government. So can I ask, is this a green light that no matter what, NSIP projects are going to actually be given the go-ahead no matter what, even if planning inspectorate blacks out all sorts of MPs' responses and all sorts of things? Or are they genuinely being taken on a case-by-case basis, or are we just going to green light any NSIP project to get more green energy?
Absolutely not. There is no automatic green light system, and I am assured that every case is looked on a case-by-case basis, on their merits, and indeed on the opinions and concerns of local communities whom they will affect. The NPPF makes clear that local planning authorities should have a positive strategy for energy from renewable and low-carbon sources, such as solar farms. It sets out that where significant development of agricultural land is shown to be necessary, areas of poorer quality should be used in preference to those of higher quality. If it is proposed to use any land that falls under Natural England's best and most versatile agricultural land, that's BMV classification, this needs to be justified during the consideration of a planning application. As defined in the NPPF, best and most versatile agricultural land constitutes land in grades 1, 2 and 3A of the agricultural land classification planning decisions, and this should continue to be made based on this definition. However, I have heard the concerns being raised by honourable members here today, and I will ensure that DLUC ministers are also made very aware of the concerns of colleagues in this room. Can
we take that, then, that there's a presumption against development on prime agricultural land? Certainly grade 1 and grade 2 and grade 3A. I take the point about 3B. But let's just deal with the first three. Is a presumption against that kind of development where it takes valuable land out of food production?
The honourable member will have heard my honourable friend, will have heard my contributions earlier, and we are determined to ensure that land is protected for food security reasons, and indeed that this green and pleasant land that we are all so proud to represent continues to be just that. And as I say, however, I understand the concerns of honourable members, and that is why I will ensure that DLUC members hear them loud and clear. Before I conclude, I would like to very briefly turn to the issue of slave labour and China. My honourable friend knows my own personal position on this issue, and I know that the FCDO will have heard loud and clear her representations here today. We are supporting the UK solar industry's main trade association, that's Solar Energy UK, in leading the response from business to include securing the solar panel industry's commitment to a robust supply chain traceability protocol, supporting a global coordinated response from the solar industry, that's the Solar Stewardship Initiative, and communicating relevant UK and international human rights frameworks. But I know that I will be engaging in meeting with the Honourable Lady in due course to discuss her new clauses proposed to the Energy Bill moving forward. I am grateful to all honourable members for attending today, and indeed to my honourable friend for securing this important debate. I will, of course, ensure that DLUC and DEFRA ministers are made aware of the issues and serious matters raised in this room this afternoon. We are committed to reforming policies so that it continues to complement wider government ambitions, namely food security and preserving agricultural land, reforming the infrastructure planning system that focuses on improving community engagement and introducing a new framework of environmental assessment through DLUC's Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. And I would like to thank once more everybody for the contributions this afternoon.
Caroline Johnson to wind up.
Thank you, Mrs. Noakes. I'll do so briefly as time is short. It's been a very interesting debate today, but I think we have got some very broad consensus that solar panels are not a great idea, not a good idea at all, and shouldn't be on in terms of on agricultural land. But I wanted to make a couple of points made by other honourable members. First, my right honourable friend from Gainsborough, who talked about the massive scale of speculators and the 10,000 acres surrounding Gainsborough, but also to mention the member from North Wiltshire, who talked about the absolutely huge scale of the very good, in his view, solar panel at RAF Lynham. It's worth mentioning that absolutely huge thing is reported on the internet as being 250 acres. The scale of the applications we're talking about in Lincolnshire are each over 2,000 acres, and in some kinds much more than that. So these really are enormous. I also want to mention the contribution of my right honourable friend for South Holland and the Deepings, who I think made some good points about the potential for innovation, and how with wind farms the innovation has driven a much better solution. And in fact, restrictions on food producing land may lead to some innovation on buildings and what sort of panels that can be produced on top of commercial centres. I think it's worth mentioning the ministers talked about protecting best and most fertile land, but they also talk about justified, and justified is based on what else is locally available. If you're in Lincolnshire, the land is good land. You're going to have to travel a long way to find land that is not good land, and therefore justifying it on the basis of what's available locally is not helpful, and I'd like him to look at that. I think we can all agree that the use of brownfield sites is better, and I will be supporting my honourable friend's amendment about the use of best and most versatile land. In my final point with my last minute, I would just say that the government needs much more joined up land use planning. It wants to build more houses, it wants to build more energy, it wants to have more land set aside for the environment, and it wants to have more land for growing food. it can't have all of them. In this case, he can't have his cake and eat it. And in fact, without the best and most versatile land producing those eggs, that flour, and the other sugar and other ingredients, he won't be able to have his cake at all.
Solar farms, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order.